Final Fantasy IX, in many ways, serves as both an ending and a new beginning for the franchise. It was the last Final Fantasy to be produced for the original PlayStation, and coincidentally, also the final single-digit installment in the main series, ushering in the turn of the century and the dawn of a new console generation. As such, it also marked the end of a development philosophy that had been the standard for the series since the very beginning. All of the games that have followed this installment, in the minds of many longtime fans, have never really been quite the same. This is likely due to the fact that Final Fantasy IX proved to be the last game into which series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi would step into an influential creative role during his tenure at Square. I think it's an interesting thought that this Final Fantasy may be the only one that's ever truly lived up to its namesake, being the last game in the series to be conceived and written by its creator. One of the most interesting things about this game's development history, however, is that there were some reservations early on about whether it should be a true main series entry or a Gaiden project. This was the result of an enormous change of direction from the previous two games in both setting and visual design. While both Final Fantasy VII and VIII had adopted the more proportioned, manga look of up-and-coming character designer Tetsuya Nomura, Final Fantasy IX saw the return of Yoshitaka Amano's unique and elegant style. And with Hideo Manaba's distinctive final designs in place, the project was firmly planted back into its roots of true, medieval-based fantasy. This was done out of a fear that if the series continued in the vein of Final Fantasy VII and VIII's more science fiction-inspired settings, that the series would begin to fall into redundancy. Some of the executives at Square were worried that this might create confusion for recent adopters of the series, alienating a prodigious fanbase that had been gained with the wild success of Final Fantasy VII. But in the end, once Hironobu Sakaguchi's vision for the project became clear, it was evident that Final Fantasy IX was indeed worthy of its Roman numeral christening. That vision, as described by Sakaguchi himself, was a game based on a reflection of all the previous works in the series. Art director Hideo Minaba later reiterated this in an interview, where he said, "As this is the last single-digit Final Fantasy, we wanted to give the feeling of a series watershed, a sort of grand collection of what has come before." This is perhaps one of the reasons why Sakaguchi has declared Final Fantasy IX to be his personal favorite, affirming that it's the closest to his ideal view of what Final Fantasy should be, and I couldn't agree more. For anyone who has played and enjoyed the early installments, Final Fantasy IX will make you feel right at home. Not only is it tonally consistent with the NES and SNES era, but it also has dozens of clever, whimsical references to its predecessors, which is sure to delight longtime fans. It also has an absolutely perfect balance between its deep, character-driven emotional elements and its charming, lovable humor, which, coupled with its intelligent and well-balanced gameplay systems, makes it one of the best the series has to offer. I think much of the credit should be given to Hiroyuki Ito, who came back for a second time in the series and for the first time in exclusivity as the game's director. Ito had co-directed Final Fantasy VI with Yoshinori Kitase, who had been a protege of Sakaguchi and worked closely with him in a directorial role on many of the previous games. But after playing through Final Fantasy IX, I really feel like Sakaguchi and Ito were the better pair. Final Fantasy IX takes place in a vast, imaginative world called Gaia, on a continent that is blanketed by a mysterious, virulent mist of unknown origin. This mist, while emanating mythical, pernicious, and even transformative qualities, is also discovered to be an abundant energy source, which the more powerful nations put to earnest use to facilitate their extravagant civilizations. Because the continent is vastly mountainous, natural barriers create firm divisions between these kingdoms, the most notable of which are Alexandria to the northeast and Lindblum to the southwest. The other kingdoms, Bermesia and Clara, while by no means primitive, embody more of an isolationist mentality, relying instead on a more archaic source for energy. The game begins with a group of bandits called Tantalus, under the guise of a traveling theater troupe, executing a secret mission issued by the regent of Lindblum to kidnap the Princess of Alexandria. It's within these opening moments that we're introduced to many of the principal characters of the story. The player takes control first of Zidane, a confident and very capable member of Tantalus who is also the primary piece in the abduction plan. Next, the player is introduced to Vivi, a young black mage with exceptional skill but timid demeanor, as he explores Alexandria leading up to the anticipated performance of Tantalus. As the plan is set in motion, we meet Garnet, the Princess of Alexandria, who, in an unexpected turn of events, actually desires to be captured and taken to Lindblum to inform the region of the odd behavior and decision-making of her mother, the Queen Braun. All does not proceed as planned, however, as Adelbert Steiner, captain of the Knights of Pluto and sworn protector of the princess, rushes to her rescue. After a wild and exciting sequence that expeditiously showcases both how intense and comical this game can be, the four unlikely heroes find their paths converge despite having, in many cases, opposing motivations. This polaric dynamic between the main characters creates a wonderfully entertaining structure that carries the game from beginning to end. I think it's an incredible cast, one of the very best in the series, if only because it's brilliantly composed for tension relief whenever it's necessary within the story. In addition to this, we also have some of the very best examples of character development within the series, which results in a cast of people who feel real and relatable despite having such a comic and fantastical appearance. I think the fact that I strongly dislike the character design in this game, especially for the main villain, but still love the characters, is a testament to how carefully and thoughtfully they were developed over the course of a relatively balanced, but also vague and convoluted tale that in a few cases requires the Ultimania to fully understand. And while we don't really get to see some of the characters' arcs resolved in a way that I think many would have wished to see, for the most part, the character development is incredibly strong. This is likely due to the fact that the game deals largely with issues of identity, with most of the characters reaching a point in their lives where discovering who they are and where they belong is a concern of paramount importance, something that everyone has at one time or another pondered and grieved about. I think Vivi above all is a character that resonates with players, as he, more than anyone else, delves into the stark, verifiable certainty of his own mortality. His growth from a meek, submissive, and fearful child who recoiled from the very thought of death into a confident, determined, and gallant young man who accepts reality and lives his life with purpose is perhaps the most pensive and meaningful piece of characterization that the Final Fantasy series has ever explored. It's that level of depth, delicately woven and introspectively relevant, that impressed me the most about this game. The great thing, however, is that while the game delves into themes of such a crucial and somber nature, it also manages to manifest an exuberant, spirited sense of fun that is both refreshing and, in my opinion, completely unrivaled by any other game in the series. This is due, as stated previously, by both a balanced and complementary cast, which utilizes character types I typically find incredibly irritating with perfect sensibility, and a return to form in its gameplay systems. While both Final Fantasy VII and VIII restricted the player to an active party of 3 members, Final Fantasy IX returned to the classic 4-man team, something I was very happy to see make a comeback. I was also happy to see many of the ideas I didn't like in Final Fantasy VIII replaced with a more traditional, tried-and-true format. The way equipment is utilized in particular is a major improvement, for example. This is actually a complaint I had that stems back to Final Fantasy VII and its dumbing down of equipment as a major part of battle strategy, but Final Fantasy VIII really took it to the next level of simplicity, replacing traditional equipment setups for spell junctioning. Luckily, this game brings a level of importance back to equipment that had been missing from the series since Final Fantasy VI. In this game, equipment is what teaches the characters their abilities, and while that might not make a lot of sense from a narrative standpoint, unlike the previous 3 games in the series that gave sensible world-building explanations, it still serves the same utilitarian purpose, and from a gameplay perspective, functions in exactly the same way. Each piece of equipment carries character abilities, which, when equipped, are slowly learned as the party gains ability points in battle. There are many who will criticize this, because what it ultimately forces you to do is equip characters obtained in the late game with early game equipment in order to learn many of their abilities, but I didn't find that to be much of an issue because of how well balanced all the equipment is. To the developer's credit, a lot of the equipment in this game remains useful even after the player has obtained a weapon or piece of armor that is technically better, because elemental properties play a much larger role in both defense and damage boosting. So even though one piece of armor may have a higher physical or defense stat, it would still be advantageous to equip a weaker piece of equipment if the situation calls for a reduction of fire damage. In other words, the benefits of the elemental protection outweigh the benefits of a higher defense stat, making more of the equipment in the game strategically valuable throughout the entire experience. It was this kind of balance and strategy in the equipment setups that I had been missing from the series for a long time. They did this not only by giving elemental boosts to early game weapons, but by making certain weapons only obtainable through synthesizing. Synthesizing is a new system added to the game that allows you to take multiple pieces of equipment and synthesize them into a new, unique piece of equipment. There are lots of different combinations you can discover by visiting all the synth shops in the game, and a lot of these combinations require early game equipment, so it's a good idea to hold on to your gear even if you initially think you'll never use it again. One thing a lot of people complain about with this game is the speed of the battles, which is admittedly far too slow. Even if you go into the settings and turn the game speed all the way up, this is by far the slowest battle system the series has seen since the introduction of the ATB bar. It's more of a minor annoyance than anything else, and as the game progresses you'll gain abilities and equipment that can boost speed enough to make it less of an issue, but it's still something that can make the game drag a bit, especially through the early game dungeons. My biggest complaint with the battle system is its use of limit breaks, which are called trances in this game. While I wasn't thrilled with how limit breaks were handled in 8, at least there was a spell the player could obtain that gave more control over when limits could be used, making them a more viable part of battle strategies. In Final Fantasy IX, the limit gauge from 7 was brought back, which fills up as the character takes damage, but once the gauge is full, the trance begins automatically. So unlike Final Fantasy VII, these trances can't be saved from one battle to the next, nor can they be ignored during the battle if the player doesn't want to use them. Trances differ from the limit breaks of previous games in that they aren't single devastating attacks unleashed in one round, but rather buff the character's stats for several rounds. This wouldn't be too much of an issue for me if not for the fact that for some of the characters, the trance state replaces certain battle commands with the character's special trance abilities, which I often found to be less useful or effective than the abilities I had them set up with in their normal state. This made the trance system more of a nuisance than an assist, and since it's entirely out of the player's hands when a trance occurs, it makes it very difficult to use them strategically. More often than not, they ended up being wasted on battles where they couldn't really make a difference, which is sorely disappointing and a huge waste of potential in my opinion. Luckily, the difficulty of the battles makes up for this, as well as some of the lack of challenge that existed in the previous games. The final boss in particular is, in my opinion, the toughest mandatory boss in the entire series, and the super boss of the game is no pushover either. It's fights like these that really require the player to utilize strategy to win, unlike the previous two games which had a few too many easy ways out of tough fights. Final Fantasy IX isn't perfect in that regard, as there's still a boss you can one-shot with a life spell or a Phoenix Down, but it's vastly improved in my opinion. It was really cool to have some fights that legitimately had me wondering whether I would make it through in one piece. When it comes to side content, this game really provides a mixed bag for me. There's some of it I love, and some of it I really hate. But my biggest grievance is that on Disc 3, the developers take what was previously a non-mandatory minigame, one that I hated with a passion, and made it mandatory to progress with the story. To me, this is a cardinal sin, because several of my friends growing up said they had to quit playing the game because they couldn't get past this sequence. I'm talking, of course, about Tetramaster, which has to be one of the worst card games I've ever heard of. Final Fantasy VIII's Triple Triad was great because 1, it was completely optional, and 2, it provided really amazing rewards for the trouble of collecting rare cards. Tetramaster does exactly neither of those things, which in turn makes it an irritating, pointless piece of side content that only poses as side content, then requires you to do it in order to finish the game whether you want to or not. The worst part is that there's no logical, plot-driven reason for it. There was simply no need to make winning the card tournament in Trino a mandatory part of the game. You may be wondering why I think Tetramaster is so bad. The answer is simple. Tetramaster is functionally similar to Triple Triad, but with multiple completely unnecessary complications and an element of randomness that can be so frustrating that I won't even waste my time explaining it in detail. In short, whether or not the card you place on the board is stronger than the opponent's, the weaker card still has a chance to win. I have no idea who thought that was a good idea, but that person was very, very wrong. Most of the other side content falls into one of two categories. 1, interesting but long-winded, and 2, simply tedious. I would say Mognet falls into the first category, where you deliver mail to Moogles that are scattered throughout the world. It's a quest that begins on Disc 1 and reaches its conclusion right at the end of the game, and it can be easy to miss steps along the way, which is annoying, but I think it's a pretty fun thing to keep an eye on as you're exploring the world. The Chocobo side quest is much better because the rewards are amazing, but it really is tedious work. I've mentioned this before on the channel, but I strongly dislike game systems that rely on a random number generator to give rewards to the player. For instance, Chocobo breeding in Final Fantasy VII. There's just way too much about that system that relies on a random selection of the program. Whether you get the correct gender or color while breeding is random. Whether you find the right enemy grouping with the Chocobo that you want to catch is very rare and random. I just can't stand minigames and side quests that rely on randomness like that. The Chocobo side quest in Final Fantasy IX requires you to play a minigame called Choco Hot and Cold, where you run around digging in the ground with a time limit in an attempt to find chocographs. I find this kind of thing incredibly irritating because it's not a system that rewards you for your level of skill. It's not a game that demands you to master a technique, or exercise ingenuity, or anything like that. It's a game where you go around pressing the square button until the game decides to reward you with the item you're looking for. And I find it frustrating that so many RPGs rely on this kind of minigame to fill their side content. Despite my grievances, however, the rewards make the effort worth it, providing some absolutely amazing equipment and treasure, and exploring the world in search of these rewards using the chocographs can be a lot of fun. I mentioned earlier how Final Fantasy IX was the last game in the series that Hironobu Sakaguchi influenced from a creative standpoint, but I think it's equally important to mention that 9 also proved to be the last game for which composer Nobuo Uematsu would exclusively write the music until Final Fantasy XIV. Uematsu's mark on the legacy of Final Fantasy is unquestionable, with his music in many ways defining the tone and character of each game. There are few composers in the industry that have had the same influence and consistency of excellence that he has exhibited, to the point where I can usually pick out Uematsu's music amongst all the rest on a co-composed soundtrack. To me, it became immediately clear when he was no longer writing all the music himself. Similarly to how the design philosophy changed after Sakaguchi's departure, so did the nature and spirit of Final Fantasy music when Uematsu left Square. To be fair, Uematsu himself asked for help on the later Final Fantasy soundtracks because he admitted to lacking inspiration, and I'm not even trying to say that the music has declined in quality by any means, because I do still think that the music is one of the strongest aspects of modern Final Fantasy games. But there was something unique and intangible that Uematsu's OSTs provided for the series that I feel has been missing to some extent since Final Fantasy IX. For me, Final Fantasy IX's soundtrack is among the best in the series, certainly sitting in my top 4, being as diverse, varied, and unique in tone as the game itself. It so elegantly captures both the astute depth and lively playfulness of the source material, and never feels out of place. It's one of those rare games where nearly every single song on the soundtrack has a melody worth memorizing, and provides that final touch of charm and personality that makes this game a true classic. And so ended the PlayStation era of Final Fantasy games. In the minds of many, that generation provided the very best the series had achieved, though the Super Nintendo also makes a great case. With 9 main series entries that were almost universally amazing games, Sakaguchi had created a legacy of excellence that both revived Square and popularized an entire genre in Western territories. Final Fantasy IX was both a reverent glance back at that legacy and a closing act that brought the best ideas of that heritage together into its most cohesive package. I may not be able to say that Final Fantasy IX is my absolute favorite game in the series, but I can say that from an objective place of analysis, and when juxtaposed with the games that came before it, it is the best and closest to the ideal Final Fantasy game that there is. I give Final Fantasy IX 4.5 man-thongs out of 5.